Welcome, colleagues, to our MT Engage Spring Speaker event. This is the first event we have had on campus since spring 2019, I think.
Wow.
So being here together today really does feel like a gift. Thank you for making it possible through your presence. Thanks also to the LT and ITC for hosting, Sheila, Tom, Scott. We really appreciate you. I am Julie Myatt, Director of MT Engage, for those of you who don't know. Back here is Lexi Denton, our wonderful Assistant Director. She has earned that donut. She's been working hard to help plan this event. So Lexi, thank you as well. And it is my great pleasure today to introduce our speaker, Dr. Peter Felton. He is Executive Director of the Center for Engaged Learning, Assistant Provost for Teaching and Learning, and Professor of History at Elon University. He's published 6 books about undergraduate education, has served as President of the International Society for the Scholarship of Teaching and Learning, is co-editor of the International Journal for Academic Development, serves on the advisory board of the National Survey of Student Engagement, and is a fellow of the John N. Gardner Institute for Excellence in Undergraduate Education, a foundation that works to advance equity in higher education. I was fortunate to meet Dr. Felton last summer at the Association of American Colleges and Universities Summer Institute on integrated learning and signature work when he was our team's mentor. Also there was Dr. Christina Cobb, who is here today, so I hope you all can connect if you haven't already. And despite the fact that we met virtually, Dr. Felton's supportive, encouraging presence was readily apparent. So when I realized that he had a book on the topic of the importance of relationships in students' educational experiences, I knew it was a must read. I am thrilled that Dr. Felton is here today to share his research from that project. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Peter Felton.
Good morning. Thank you, Dr. Mike. The only people who call me Dr. Felton are my children. So we have some rules in my house. So you can call me Peter. This is a Friday morning. It's April. It's been a couple of years. Yeah. So it's okay to be tired and all this. We're going to be conversational. I'll present some stuff. Some of you, well, I'll explain what some of you are going to do. You're going to be talking with each other a few times. We'll be talking with the whole group quite a lot, okay? Thinking about these sorts of things. And I also want to say, when I was working with Julie and friends on MT Engage last summer, I was so impressed with what you all are doing here and the aspirations that you have for it. It's really, really, really important work. So thanks for having me. It's exciting to be the first 3D person. A couple of years, too. Okay, so RelationshipFrench Education. One thing you probably know already, and Julie's got the slides and there's references and things like that. You can have all that. One thing you probably know, either anecdotally from your own experience as a student, as a professor in whatever role you have, or from reading any of the literature on higher education, is that the relationships are probably the most important factor in essentially everything good we want to happen in undergraduate education. And when I say relationships, I mean student-faculty, staff-faculty, and student-student relationships. Those 3 kinds of relationships. And you could talk about anything. You could talk about persistence to graduation. You could talk about motivation. You could talk about learning. Weird alumni who report having strong relationships in college are more likely to vote than alumni who report not. I don't know what that means, but I think I want alumni to vote. So that's good. And you might remember the Gallup-Purdue study from 2014 where they surveyed 30,000 college graduates 10 years or more out from graduating. And they found one of the major findings of that study was if an alum reported having one professor who cared about them as a person, inspired them to learn, and challenged them to follow their dreams, one, that alum was more than twice as likely to report thriving professionally and personally 10 years after graduating. One. So a couple things to know about this. These interactions, these relationships matter. One thing is it's quality, not quantity. This isn't like TikTok, where if you get, I don't really understand TikTok, but I think more is better, right? And students often think more is better. We actually did a survey of 4,000 alums, recent alums, in 2019, nationally representative sample. And if they reported having 3 to 5 significant relationships while they were in college, with professors, with staff, with peers, they were 3 times as likely to say college was worthwhile as people who had fewer. Right? So this matters a lot. It contributes to all the good stuff in college. It contributes to significant stuff after college. It contributes to value in college. Second, so quality more than quantity. Second thing to know, and this won't surprise you either, is there's really significant equity stakes here. The research is very, very clear that for students of color and first-gen students, relationships are more important, either positively or negatively. What that means is the positive benefits of having meaningful, constructive peer relationships, faculty relationships, staff relationships are more positive for students of color and first-gen students. And the absence of relationships or negative interactions are more harmful for first-gen students and students of color. Again, that probably doesn't surprise you because there's equity gaps that are very real. And I'm not saying relationships are the solution to all things. I'm not saying relationship will resolve all equity gaps. But being really intentional about building relationship-rich classes, programs, curricula, institutions is a pretty powerful path towards more equitable, more successful, equitable institutions, more successful students. Does that make sense? That's all the research that existed. And then you're like, so Peter, you wrote a book? This sounds really awesome. Like all these other people did all this research and then you wrote a book. Right, but what happened, what Leo and I did is, Leo, my co-author, had been president of Elon for almost 20 years. And we'd done some writing and some thinking together. And we kept talking to people he talks to boards and stuff like this, and I talk to humans. And we'd ask them, what's important in college? And they would talk about relationships. And you'd ask undergraduates and alumni, you ask alumni, tell me a story about your experience at MTSU. They talk about people. Right? Terrell Strayhorn, who's a scholar of belonging, has this great line. He says, programs don't retain students. People retain students, right? So we talk about all these things, and it ends up being people. So we said, so the challenge we thought in the book was, if we know this is true, both in research and anecdotally, why don't we act like it is? Why isn't my course set up so that students are going to really interact meaningfully with each other and maybe with me? Why isn't all our programs set up to center this? Why doesn't the institution reward this and support this and talk to students about why this is so important? So what we did, the short version of what we did, is we ended up visiting 29 campuses. This is back when you could get on airplanes without having to submit all your health records forever and all this kind of stuff. And we talked to about 400 people, just under 400 people, 204 undergrads, the rest faculty and staff. And we asked them about meaningful relationships, challenges with relationships. We looked at programs that did really interesting things. And so what we're going to do in this time together, I'll be doing is sharing some of the quotes from these interviews, because those interviews drive the book. I'm a historian by training. I think stories sort of are the thing. So rather than give you a lot of statistics, give you some stories. And some of you were brave enough or early enough that you got roped into reading those. So just so we're not staring at the screen, but you can hear colleagues. Does that make sense? For what it's worth, this book, it came out on Election Day 2020, which we thought was an interesting time because we wrote this book and we submitted it and then a pandemic hit and we're like, oh, crap. That was good. And then, there was an election which might have, anyway. But it seems to resonate with a lot of people. So our publisher, Johns Hopkins, said, could you write a book like this for students? So we have a book like this for students coming out next February. It's going to be open access, free, online, OER person. Right, you could still buy it. The Johns Hopkins people are like, tell people to buy it, right? But don't buy it. But we decided we couldn't just ride on 200 interviews from 2019. So we interviewed a ton of students in 2021. And I don't formally put them in because just the last 2 weeks we started getting permission to name everybody. Everybody whose name you're going to see is an actual human we interviewed. And it was important to us to do this, like, to tell real people's stories, not just be like, subject A said this. Right? So anyways, I've got lots more stories about students during the pandemic. Really powerful. And faculty and staff during the pandemic. Because what y'all did is really important for students. In a minute, I'm going to ask you to talk to each other. Before you do that, I had a grad school professor who taught me something really powerful, somewhat traumatic, but still really powerful. Which first semester, year-long graduate course, and he kept saying, Mr. Felton, history is not a mystery. Don't save everything to the end. So in Dr. Forgey's honor, just 4 key things when I'm talking about relationship-rich education, what you're thinking about. What I want you thinking about, what you want you knowing as you think about these things. 4 key things from the book, and you can see them, right? The first is what students need as a fundamental, is what one person we interviewed called relentless welcome. And this person, and a lot of the students we interviewed said, the school here, the program here is great, like they have a really nice orientation. I felt really connected at orientation. And then first day of class, the professors were really good, and I felt good about that. Now it's August or April, whatever, 15th, 14th, something like this. I'm really tired. I walk around campus, nobody says hi to me. I go into class, I look at my phone before class, the professor talks the whole time, and then I look at my phone and I don't talk to anybody. And they're like, that day, it's as important that I feel like I belong. I feel like I'm welcome. I feel like it matters that I'm here as every other day. Right? So think about how do we do that foundational stuff of welcome and belonging. The second thing, and honestly, this one surprised me a little. I was a little worried in our interviews that I was going to hear sort of what I imagine, a historian, you're supposed to be rigorous and all this. That we're going to hear sort of kindergarten stories. It's like, oh, I love Professor whoever, they're so nice. What students said to us over and over is what the research actually says, which is students said, I work harder when I feel like the professor knows who I am. I don't want to disappoint them. Right? And so relationships drive motivation in that way. We heard so much from students about staff believing in students in ways that nobody else does, and often nobody else in their life ever had. Saying you're capable, I know you can do this. Just paying attention to them, how powerful that was. And then peer relationships. Sometimes as competition, I got to do better than them. Most often inspiration. Either I'm learning, like, I know how to do this thing in chemistry now because I learned it from my classmate, but even more near peers. It's like, oh, they're doing this. And they're only a year ahead of me. Right? If they can do this, I can do this. Right? So relationships, these kinds of interactions, drive motivation really powerfully. Third thing that we see in the book, again, it's really clear in the mentoring research, is that, and those of us who have PhDs or grad degrees, often when we think about relationships, we think about one person, right? Like you had a dissertation supervisor, and they guided you or abused you or whatever they did for a few years, right? And then they helped you get a job and, blah, 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 and they really shaped you as a professional. We're not having a conversation whether that's good for grad education or not. But for undergraduates, that's not what they need. What they need is what Brad Johnson, who's a scholar of mentoring at the Naval Academy, he has this great phrase. He said, students need a constellation of mentors. Right? They need different people who can do different things for them. So they need someone in the Career Center to help them in certain ways, but they need someone in the Writing Center to help them in other ways, and they need someone in the lab, in exercise science, to help them in other ways. That's what they need. So we need to help them build those kinds of constellations. I like that. Sometimes people talk about, like, you should have a board of directors or something. As a non-business, I think businesses should have boards of directors. I don't want to have a board of directors, but Constellation sounds really nice. One other thing to note about Constellation of Mentors in that research, and we heard this from students, is that means I don't have to be the center of the universe for that student, right? Which is not to say I'm abdicating all my responsibilities, but if a student comes to me and they're really struggling to get a job or they want to get this internship and they don't know what to do, I don't have to answer that. I can say, let me connect you to my friend at the Career Center, and they can help you, right? So we can be part of a network that supports students rather than it's all on us. Because if it's all on us, we're going to lose, right? There's too many of them, there's not enough of us. There's too many of my students and not enough of me, right? So we've got to think about this in that way. And then the last thing is so much of how students are talked to about education, so much about how students approach education now is transactional. We heard in many different campuses some version of my goal is to get in, to get through, and get out. And that's important, right? I'm not saying students shouldn't do those things. But if that's all you do, then we're just credentialing. And universities should be a lot more than that. And students can think about, who am I? What kind of professional do I want to be? What kind of citizen do I want to be? How do I contribute to my family, to my community? They can do that on their own. They can do that with people outside the university. But if they're going to do that while they're students, the most powerful way to do that is with trusted peers, with trusted staff, and with trusted faculty. And it doesn't have to be complicated. It's people asking, like, what do you want to do? Why do you want to do that? Simple questions. So we'll get into that. Okay, so that, in honor of Dr. Forby, is sort of the heart of what I mean by relationship-rich education. But I've been talking too long, and there's a Domino in my name. So I'm going to ask you to talk, in maybe group 3 or 4. If you came with people you know and you're sitting with them, you could decide to be brave and talk to somebody else, but you don't have to. But talk about 2 things. One, what do you do already that works in building relationships, either with students, among students, etc. And then 2, at MTSU in your work, why is this hard? Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. I'll set a timer for 8 minutes and I'll harass you then. But have a little conversation and then we're going to have some large group conversation. Great. Do
you want to do like together? All right. I'm Elisha. What are your names? Okay, great. Yeah. I work here because of Melinda. She put in a good word for me. Awesome. So, we should probably start with the policy. I think barriers pop up.
I know,
So I think that working my classes a lot. One class in particular, as I was reading this book, I realized that worked really well and what I knew replicated another class. So teach actually. And so one of the things they do is they have these small groups where they usually have like a series of tasks they do that ask them to reflect on their lives and the communication skills and experiences they have. And then in class, there's times outside, several days, like 6 days of class, where they meet groups of other students who have said that they also want to work on that communication skill. And then they talk about their lives. And they talk about what they're working on and what happened to them. And I've had a few of those groups, like one of them is like a bridesmaid and the other one's wedding anniversary senior. There's another one who has cancer and a lot of trials recently, and she is still connected with her members and they go eat together. And so, like, that has worked so well. And in part, it's because their grade was not being dependent upon this working on it. There will be an supportive workplace where they're making connections between their lives and each other. And that's an early course. So like they know those students and they keep in touch with those students in the other classes. They might even sign up and take classes with people from that class. And so that's something that like I struggle into actually very and so I'm like, okay, I'm gonna keep that and I'm trying to figure out how I can replicate that experience. That's
Grading process, I think it's actually super important if you give them opportunities to write about something they care about and then to read each other's work, they really get to know each other, especially for students who talk with them. They can read each other's work, you can get to know them about it. And then you're removing barriers, policies that might create competition. So like assessment and the actual plan. Colleagues and I got married and then followers, people that are best friends I do think some of the barriers that we create big solid they're like other I don't know what he's going to say. I also study the tutors like I heard they love each other so much. We try to make it incorporate collections and
Yeah, it's interesting. So,
Two more minutes and you're a breakout room.
to think about motivating relationships. I think the way that I'm trying to use out is one by just taking it through so that when I present to classes, going and talking with students that I've met before and making sure that they see, oh, you as a piece were very helpful with the selective issues. It's hard to think about how to multiple in the role that in general in a lot of relationships with other students, organizational leaders, both like student organizations and colleges, where students are consistently showing up and they see a familiar face and know that this is supportive. I love the conversation because I can't be before this I was a campus minister. I was they're done regularly. So it's just adjusting. I can't do everything and be okay. Try to do an hour, 2 hours.
It's hard for students on the internet as this place that are and it is also very
Right.
whereas I think trying to engage on this, I don't want to say soft, but in some ways more interpersonal. I don't think it's your fault. I think there's so much more time in that.
Sure. No.
Right here in college, they're gonna always through. And they're like, shut what's off, right? And then there's so that's part of the whole thing about it. And I think they're really good
Okay, can we come back together, please? And I hate to do that because there's so much energy in the small groups. But it's got to be all about me. Come on. You're going to get to talk to each other some more. Right.
You started it.
I started it. I know. So don't you yearn for the days of Zoom when all the cameras were off and you could talk all day long and no one would No. So you had things to talk about. And we could spend all day talking about the examples of really good things you were doing. But did you hear anything in your group that was like, that's a really cool idea, or that was a beautiful story? I heard a really beautiful story, and I'm not going to point the person out yet. But anything you want to share with the whole group about what works right now? Yeah.
Carlos shared how he builds relationships with his graduate assistants.
Yeah.
And I see that. He's in the College of Business.
Okay.
And he really helps develop those in that aspect. That's an opportunity.
Yeah.
And he gets invited to their weddings.
What do you do? Oh, yeah. What do you do to build those relationships? What's the...
Well, we have 12-month positions, so they work with me 12 months and it's a year and a half most of the time. So we work together every day, basically, or every week, not every day, but every week. Yeah, focusing in their academic, making sure they do good grades, and when they are about to graduate, we started looking for what would be a good fit positions, opportunities out there, stuff like that.
Thank you.
And connecting with my previous assistants because they are in the market and they know what openings are, what would be a good fit for them.
That's great. Yeah, but that's probably a good assessment. It's like, do you get invited? Like, yeah, maybe that was a
The
really...
Indian wedding was 2 days long.
Oh, yeah. There we go. Yeah, one of my research students invited me to her wedding, and I didn't know this at the time. Both her parents worked for the CIA. This was the most interesting dinner conversation ever, because they put me with like random people. This is such an aside. Random people, and we started talking, and like these people knew way too much about countries. Yeah, because one of the other people was like, yeah, I spent a year in the Peace Corps in Ecuador, and they're like, oh, Ecuador. And I didn't know this. So, anyways, go to CIA weddings. That's my lesson. Okay. Other examples. Yeah.
All the faculty members that I had the conversation with have student organizations that they advise, and they've created that space for smaller groups of students.
Which is great too, because you advise them, but it's not you one-on-one all the time. Right. So it's creating a structure to support students in connecting with each other in meaningful ways. Yeah, one of the interviews from the new book was this student. His name's Abram Segunda. We just got permission to name him yesterday. Really cool story from Abram. When we interviewed him, he was a student at San Antonio College. He's now at UT San Antonio. And he said, I wasn't first in my family to go to college. I was first in my family to make it a whole semester through college, right? And then he withdrew, and it was fascinating because he said his parents were like, that was awesome. You made it a whole semester, right? Which would have been a different conversation with my family. And he worked for a while, and then he went back to college, And he said I had a better sense of what I wanted to do, but the other thing is I realized when I worked, I had peers who I relied on when I struggled with things. So he wants to work in exercise science. So he joined the kinesiology club, first thing he got back. And he had this great wine, which I love. He's like, now when I get stressed at school, I go to the club. Pretty cool. Awesome. Any other examples?
I think Rebecca had a really good example.
Okay, that's a great move too. So Rebecca.
I was telling them that I actually teach a course on relationships, and at the beginning of the semester, they do a survey and they tell me of 4 different skills, which one do they feel they most need to improve on in their communication. And then I put them in groups based on what they said their collective struggle was. They have a series of assignments, including things like journals or reading a research article. And they meet 4 or 5 times in class, and their grades are not dependent. It's just purely a supportive, reflective group. And so over the course of that semester, they learn a lot about each other, they support each other, and I've had students who on purpose, start taking classes with that person throughout their program, or like one of my students has had cancer off and on, and she still goes to eat with her group members and texts them, and they provide support, for those groups, that might be the difference between finishing and not finishing, right?
No. I mean, one of the people we interviewed who runs a national program for adult students, I hate that phrase, but older students, whatever you want to call them, said those students carry each other to graduation. Right? I thought, Rebecca, you were going to get, and then we go to their wedding.
Right.
But I love this. It wouldn't surprise me based on your story. I thought that's where we were going. But I love this. So this is a purposeful thing for the class. But it ends up forming this sort of friendship networks that are really powerful, right? And isn't that a really cool outcome of a class? They get better at the things you're trying to help them get better at, and they get connected to people who matter to them in some way. That's really great. So, you all know how to do this, and there's great examples. So why is it hard? Why don't you do it all the time? Zoom. So it was easy before the pandemic. Easier. Yeah. Zoom makes it a lot harder.
That informal space and conversations before class, at the end of class, often went away with Zoom. Students, especially as we moved into the pandemic, started turning their cameras off, so you didn't even have a face.
Yeah.
And that made it a lot harder for them to relate to one another, to get to know one another, and for us to get to know them.
Yeah, there's this really cool research out of Sweden where they were looking at students' social networks before Zoom, before the pandemic and during the pandemic. And what happened is all of the loose ties disappeared, right? So you were still connected to the important people in your life. You just lost everybody else, at least in Sweden, and undergraduates. So yeah, Zoom makes it harder.
So when we talked about shifting, like us being able to adapt to that, right?
Yeah.
So we talked about breakout rooms and Zoom, like just kind of making the best out of it.
Yeah.
So yes.
Yeah. But finding ways. I mean, some of it was, because I don't know about you, but when in olden days, when I'd walk into the first day of class sometimes, everybody's doing that.
Yeah.
Right? And so we didn't need Zoom to be totally isolated. And it took me a while to realize a lot of them were doing this because they don't know anyone in the class and they don't want to talk to anybody. Right? So this is a socially acceptable thing to do. And so what do I do with Zoom? What do I do in the space to help build those connections? Because I don't like going up to strangers and talking to them. Okay. Other things that make this hard?
For me, I find it easy to connect with the students that are easy to connect with.
Yes.
I get lost with the students that are the one-word responders and the ones that are, harder to talk to or less willing to talk with me.
Yeah. Thank you, Lexi. Yeah, there's a great quote in the book from a professor at Oakton Community College outside Chicago where they have this program called the Persistence Project, which involves a faculty member volunteering. You pick one course each semester, and you do 4 things in the first 3 weeks. You get to know and use students' names, you give students feedback, formative feedback, you talk about high expectations and resources on campus, and you have a one-on-one meeting with them. And the results of the persistence project are really amazing. 8% stronger persistence semester to semester, 25% for Black men, right? Really significant. It's just super hard to scale. So they've tried a bunch of different things, and it's the meeting that's the magic. And what Holly Graff, who's one of the professors, said about it is there's a huge difference between getting to know some of my students and getting to know all of my students.
We said lack of time, which is also related to class size.
Yeah,
So if
exactly.
the class sizes are smaller, you have more time.
Yeah.
Before class, you get there early, more time to connect after class.
Yeah.
Even inviting them to your office, you actually have the time for those meetings if the class size is a little small.
Well, exactly. You can't do the persistence project with a class of 300. You just can't. Not one-on-one, at least. Yeah. So, and everybody is pressed for time, including our students. In class size. And class size works against us. No. It's a barrier for students, too. Because, before the pandemic, I spent some time in Canada, and I got to know this guy who runs an Indigenous Studies program at the University of Calgary. And he said, it's interesting if you think about your classroom like your home. And he says, when you have guests into your home, one of the things they're doing when they come into your home is they're looking around trying to figure out who you are, right? And he says, our students do that when they come into class the first day. They look at the classroom and they pretty quickly are like, I know how this thing works, right? There's a ton of seats all facing the same direction. And there's a battle station at the front and a little tiny professor, right? And it's like, I know what my role is here, which is to be anonymous. Right? And they figure that out, even though we're nice and warm and welcoming and I want to get to know you. They're like, no, you don't. So there are really serious barriers. There's a lot more we could talk about, but I want to get into some of our research, some of the voices from that research, starting with Jen. And Jen?
Yes.
Oh, my whole goal today was to eat a donut from this place because it was really good. And then to remember Jen's name because I wasn't sure I would forget it. Jen is going to read the first quote from the research, and it's from someone named David Latimer. I want to tell you about each of the people I'm quoting. David Latimer, when we interviewed him, he was really proud. He described himself as a fourth-generation college graduate, which I thought was pretty cool. I never thought of it that way. Like, I'm a second-generation college graduate, but he's fourth-generation college graduate. Spent most of his career working in the Harlem Children's Zone in New York, working with young Black males, preparing them to go to college. And after doing that for about 20 or 25 years, he said, I had to go work in higher ed because so many of these students would leave with so much promise and come back unsuccessful. It's like, and I couldn't figure out why that was because it wasn't them, right? And he said, so he went to work at the City University of New York as an academic advisor. And so he's worked for about 15 years as an academic advisor now, literally talked to thousands of students. And he's at City Tech, which serves mostly first-gen, low-income immigrant students in technology fields, right? And we asked David, so why is this stuff hard for students? And this is what he told us.
Students fear failure and being challenged beyond their limits. They may not have been challenged academically in high school, and for the first time are really experiencing academic rigor. They fear embarrassing their families, being afraid to come home and say, I'm not achieving in college right now, I'm struggling. They fear talking to a professor because a professor represents an intimidating authority figure. They also resist asking for academic help because that is perceived as meaning you're not smart. They do not want to go to counseling when they have emotional problems because that's for people who are weak. The fear of shame is everywhere.
Thanks, Jen. And what he's not saying is students are snowflakes. What he's saying actually mirrors the research, especially on first-gen students. That Claude Steele, who's a psychologist at Stanford, has this phrase to describe first-gen students and Black students, which is over-efforting. And he says how they got into MTSU, how they got to be successful enough to be the first in their family to get to college, is to just work harder. And the solution to every problem is to work harder. And that works quite a lot in life. But you get to points in life where just working harder isn't going to do it. And if that's your only tool, then you're going to struggle, right? And especially if you have this sense that asking for help is shameful. We interviewed a student, I just got permission to use her name too, Ole Gonzalez. She's a student going to graduate this spring from Nevada State College, DACA student. Amazing, going to grad school. She said, first in her family to go to college in the United States. She said when she got to Nevada State, she thought using the tutoring center, the writing center, things like going to office hours, she thought that was cheating. That was her word. Cheating? And she's like, oh yeah, that's not, you can't do that. Right? So I've talked to so many people at colleges and they're like, oh, we tell students about this stuff, but they don't use the resources. Well, if you think the resources are shameful to use, if you think it's cheating to use these resources, you're not going to. David says most of his job now is trying to encourage students to develop help-seeking behaviors that are constructive. Academic help-seeking behaviors, personal help, professional help-seeking behaviors. It's like, that's what it all is. Because if they have those, they're going to be okay. But if you know the research on shame, if you are ashamed, you tend to isolate yourself because you don't want anyone to know whatever you're ashamed about. And the more you isolate yourself, the less likely you are to be successful, right? So you set up this cycle. That is the fundamental challenge, David says. And then, I don't know who has this one, so I'm not going to get to call you by name. But preview, we didn't know a pandemic was coming, but we did know higher ed wasn't just face-to-face. And so we actually went to Southern New Hampshire University. There's a place. Then we talked to students who are all over the country, but we went there and we talked to some people. Aaron Schreier, who we interviewed, is one of their writing coaches. And writing coaches at Southern New Hampshire, for the first semester students are there, they talk to their writing coach every week. So they get to on the phone, which is fascinating. But that's low tech. Everybody can do that, right? So Aaron gets to know students really well. And I don't know who has this quote, but this is what she said.
One of the biggest hurdles our students have to overcome is the feeling of being adrift in online classes, where they don't get to see each other face to face, and when they can't go up to their instructor or to a friend in class to say, I'm really struggling with this, or I'm excited I've learned that.
Thank you. Right? This is exactly what you were saying. Zoom breaks those barriers. It will continue to, right? And hybrid does too, because I don't know about your campus. My campus, even though we're back, it feels different. Like it's not as many people around all the time. And so I think it's a little lonelier. Right? And there is so much power in those informal interactions. So that's hard. One more thing that I want to just explicitly name as hard is, of course, we live in a society that isn't equitable. And the challenges that exist outside the campus come into the campus. And so a student, we interviewed, Khadijah Shea, told us about her experience at Bryn Mawr College. Bryn Mawr is a highly selective women's college outside Philadelphia. Someone's got this one?
I got that one.
Great, here we go.
Coming to college was a difficult experience for me. There was the just being away from home part, and then there was race. I never felt like I was a student first. I was always black first, and then a student. For example, during my junior year, I remember walking into class on the day after Tamir Rice was killed by police. I was distraught. I walked into class and sat there, and it seemed like no one else was fazed by it. The day went on as usual for other students. It was just so surreal to have all of this weight on me because of something that happened, and not feeling that reflected at all by the students and professors around me.
Thank you. And just a little bit more about Khadijah. She told us she's from Cleveland, which is where Tamir Rice is from. Not the same neighborhood. She has a little brother who's the same age as Tamir Rice. So this, as if police killing a 13-year-old boy is not tragic enough, then thinking about your brother, right? And she said she felt like that next day she had a force field around her. Like nobody wanted to say anything to her, not even like hi, right? And so she felt so isolated. And so we asked her what would have helped. And she said someone saying, how are you? She's not like, I was expecting my physics professor to say, something terrible happened in Cleveland. Well, let's solve systemic racism and police violence today in physics class. I wasn't saying that. It's just saying, recognize me as a human. Recognize what's going on. Right? That's what she said she needed. She didn't go to class for a week. And she said she sat in her room by herself and cried basically the whole week. Right? So these things come with our students. They come with us too, but they come with our students. And they really shape their experiences with us. So what do we do about this? Someone's got this one, and we're getting to the more optimistic parts. This is from Matt Smith at Cal State Dominguez Hills. Matt is Dean of Students there now. When we interviewed him, he was interim Dean of Students, so it can happen if you're ever in interim. Cal State Dominguez Hills is in South Central LA. It's essentially all students of color, all low-income students, a large percentage of immigrant students. And Matt said, in teaching at Cal State Dominguez Hills, it's not that hard. It comes down to one thing.
Once students realize that you care about them, about where they come from, about their goals and what they're trying to accomplish, then you have a strong foundation for teaching and learning.
Exactly. Thank you. What he's saying is if you really are into higher ed research, you might recognize this Laura Rendon's theory of validation. And Rendon, she just retired. She was a professor in Texas, studied especially Latino students, Latinx students in Texas and the Southwest, undergraduates. And what she found isn't what people sometimes think when they hear a word like validation, where you think self-esteem, and it's like, you get an A and you get an A. It's the opposite. It's, I know you, and I know you can do better. I know you're capable. It's fundamentally about expressing belief in students' capacity, right? And if students feel like somebody at the institution believes in their capacity to be successful, Rendon's work and lots of work afterwards shows they're more likely to work hard, they're more likely to ask for help, they're more likely to graduate, all the good things, right? So it comes down to validation. So how do you do this? I'll give you one example from research that blew my mind when I saw this. It actually was sort of traumatizing because it was so clear. And then a couple stories. This is the research that really hurt me when I read it first. It's by Darnell Cole, who's a scholar at the University of Southern California. And it's a large study of how Black and Latino male undergraduates receive feedback from professors in college. And what he found is what I was trained to do as a grad student, which is a feedback sandwich, is alienating for these students. So in my history class, saying, Julie, thanks for actually writing 2 pages on this 2-page assignment. That was great. And in pen, too. Next time have a thesis statement and some evidence, but keep writing 2 pages, right? That's really condescending, the way I did it. But that kind of wrapping positive with negative is alienating because the students tend to interpret that as condescending. And what Cole's research says, and I believe, and I think there's research that supports, this is good for all students, not just male students of color. Really good feedback emphasizes we have high expectations here at TSU and in this program. I know you can meet those expectations. I've seen you in various ways get there or get partway there. This work does or doesn't get there, right? So it's not sugarcoating it. It's like, this work is bad. It's not showing your full capacity. This is what you need to do. These are the resources to support you. Does that make sense? So to Julie, it's Julie, you've written good papers in this class before. This is not a good paper. It doesn't have a thesis statement. It doesn't have any evidence. I know you can write better papers than this. Next time, go with a writing center. Come to my office. Start sooner. You're capable of doing more than this. Right? That's much more powerful feedback. Notice how it's relational feedback too, because it's I know you're capable. Right? It's validating well it's doing. Yeah.
Can you repeat the name of the person who did the validation?
Darnell, Laura Rendon. Yeah, and I've got citation. So it's REMDO. So how do you do this? That's feedback. But how do you do it in other ways? Are you? Okay, this is a long one, and we're going to pause. It's 2 slides, but it's the best quote I think, in the whole book. So I got to tell you about Josh Rodriguez. When we interviewed him, he said he's born in the U.S., but his parents are not from the U.S. First in his family to go to college. Did really well in high school, always wanted to be a nuclear engineer. Grew up in Chicago, got a scholarship to the University of Illinois. Went there for 1 semester, did great, hated it, and withdrew after 1 semester. Went home, got married, worked, raised a family, and when his kids were starting to get towards middle school, he decided, I still want to be a nuclear engineer, and I want to be the kind of dad who shows my kids that we can do this, right? So he went to the local community college, Oakton Community College. First day of class was his 30th birthday. But, getting in his headspace. And the first class he took back was Calculus 2, which seems puzzling to me, but he got an A in Calculus 2 at the University of Illinois, and he wants to be a nuclear engineer. So you don't get to skip Calculus 2, right? So he's got a plan. So this is what he said about that class.
Early in Calculus 2, we started getting into really difficult things, and I suddenly began having these feelings like I don't belong in this class, that my education, what I was trying to achieve, wasn't possible, and my goals were just obscenely farther away than I thought they were.
Just wait a second. So notice this, because he doesn't say what I would have said to myself, I think, which is like, why did I take Calculus 2? Or math is hard. He says, what I'm trying to achieve in my life is obscenely further away than I thought. That's pretty different than math is hard. Here we go.
I went to Professor Arco to say that I might have to drop out. He told me, Joshua, I don't want you to do that homework tonight. I want you to look up imposter syndrome and read about it, and come talk to me. I did that, and I learned that it is extraordinarily common among students. That interaction bolstered my confidence to realize that I'm not alone in this, that everyone has these feelings. I went from contemplating dropping out to getting tutoring for help, and then getting an A in the course.
Thank you. And to finish the story, since I told you it was his 30th birthday, Josh graduates this spring from Purdue in nuclear engineering. And he would say, he did, I actually talked to him in January. He said Professor Arco is the reason he's going to graduate. Professor Arco was an adjunct who taught 1 semester. Right? He didn't ever have a conversation with Professor Arco outside the classroom. Not once. He doesn't know where Professor Arco is now. He's actually asked me if I know where he is. So they think professors know stuff.
CIA people help.
I should have brought it like that. And they're like, oh, we know about her. What happens in this story, though, is what Brad Johnson, the scholar of mentoring I mentioned before, calls someone being a mentor of the moment. Right? Which is different than being a mentor, which is a long-term, deep relationship, developmental, reciprocal. Professor Arco was a mentor of the moment. He saw what Joshua really was struggling with. Didn't just give them a pat answer of, keep doing your homework, you'll be fine. Right? And gave him the feedback he needed. Gave him the support he needed to succeed, right? That's what it comes down to. It sounds easy. But that, in some ways, is scalable. In some way, right? And it can be so transformational for students, right? So how do we do this? I'm going to give you one more story and then 4 practices, which are not meant to be all the practices in the world. They're just 4 that kept coming up in the interviews. But first, a story. I don't know who's got Jose's. Okay, great. Jose is another one of these. I love this interview. First in his family to go to college, he goes to Nevada State, which is outside of Las Vegas. It's a newer institution, founded in 2000, serves almost all Latinx people. Jose, first in his family, wants to be a nurse because he wants a good job, he wants good pay, he wants to support his family and give back to his community. So he gets to Nevada State, and his advisor says you have to take a non-life science course. And I recommend you take it your first year because get it out of the way. And he's like, that's stupid. I'm taking all these courses for nursing, and I have to take other science courses? Like, yes. Right? So Jose, not happy. So he signs up for Intro to Geology, Tuesday, Thursday at 11 a.m. He doesn't care about rocks. It's convenient, right? This is how he described the course.
He said, my professor made something as boring as rocks interesting. The passion she had, her subject was something that she loved. The most important thing is that the class became a community. She made us interact with each other and with the subject. It just came together because of her passion.
Thank you. And it's like, I teach the Puritans sometimes. It's like, we all have things that maybe are as boring as rocks. But we can help our students become passionate about it. It's interesting if you look at his quote too, because he keeps saying passion, and that's important, but he's also saying course design and pedagogy, right? She made us interact with each other and with the material in ways that we became a community. Notice he also doesn't say she became my mentor, I was close to her. It's she inspired me. It's not she did stuff one-on-one with me to turn me around. So there's a lot we can do in how we organize our classes, how we demonstrate our love for a discipline and for what we teach. Right? That can do a lot for students. What else? 4 quick things from the research. One, this is almost my favorite research ever in higher ed. It's from Arizona State University. Huge introduction to biology courses. In person, hundreds of students. And the question was, does it matter if the professor knows students' names? And the really cool thing they found is it actually doesn't matter if you know their names. It matters if they perceive you care to know their name. And I will never remember all their names. I have a hard time with 33 students, right? But I can make it clear that I want to know their name, that it's, I got Jen right, woohoo! You think I'm good at names. I'm not. I know one person's name, right? So, but if students perceive you care to know their name, all these good things come with this. What they found works in these large intro face-to-face courses at Arizona State was name tags, requiring students to make and use name tags. And there's some great stuff in this paper because they said they were just looking at the students' perceptions of professors. But what they found is students actually started calling each other by name. And as somebody in the paper said, one of the students in the paper said, it's a lot easier to ask someone you've been sitting next to a long time, hey, Jen, do you want to study together? Than, hey, do you want to study together? And I can't remember your name. Right? So, convey that you care to know them. Second thing, think about how office hours work. And I think this one's over here.
Yes.
Yeah, just a quick. Sean Becerra is chair of psychology at the University of Iowa, teaches huge neuroscience classes. And he said for years, he's a really dedicated teacher. He'd have office hours, he'd be ready for students to come, and no one ever came. And he's like, and I didn't want to do work that they would interrupt, so I just wasted time, was frustrated. He changed his office hours in a substantial way about 8 years ago, and it transformed things. Here we go.
I hold my office hours in the residence hall. Students don't want to come see me one-on-one, so I encourage them to come with a roommate, a study partner, or on their own, but expecting not to be alone. We meet in a prominent, comfortable place in the residence hall. A lot of informal relationships evolve in conference room hours by having them interact with both me and their peers.
Thank you. Yeah, he said you can actually, one of the conference rooms he'll do, there's a huge first-year dorm at the University of Iowa, so he always tries to get on the ground floor there. And he said there's this thing, you can see students walk, and they start like way on the other side of the lobby, like, I'm not going over there, I'm not going over there, and then they look, and they're like, oh, there's people in there, I can go. Right? So, because they don't want to be one-on-one with them. But they will go if there's other people. He says, he's pretty convinced there have been weddings coming out of office, or conference room hours, right? There have never been weddings coming out of my office hours. Right? Nobody. So thinking about, we're doing this anyways. How do we make it into something that's powerful? It doesn't take Sean any more time, except he has to walk to the conference room. He doesn't prepare. I was talking to someone earlier this week, who teaches at the University of South Carolina, and he started calling, when he teaches intro to Gen Chem, he says he doesn't call them office hours anymore. He calls them review hours. He said, like, half the students come. He's got to get a big room. And he's like, it's the same thing. And all he does is say, what do you want to review? And then they say things, and then they review it. Yeah, there's this, I don't know if you know Tony Jack's book on the privileged poor. If you don't, you should read it. It's a really powerful book, Anthony Jack. It's a study of Harvard students, so it's not quite MTSU or Elon students, but really, really interesting study of low-income students at Harvard. And one of the things he said is, if you go into classes first day, almost every professor says when their office hours are. Almost no professor says what their office office hours. And if you don't know what office hours are, having someone say my office hours are Mondays 3 to 5, who cares, right? But if you say this is when we review, you should come review.
I had a student that told me she thought that office hours meant that that's when the professor went in there to do their work, so you weren't supposed to disturb them during their office hours.
No, thank you, because there was a study at the Los Angeles Community College District. They surveyed students there about a bunch of things. One of them was, what are office hours? And the most common answer was, that's the only time faculty have to do their work. And so if you look and they're like, they're only in their office 3 hours a week, I'm never gonna go, right? They gotta be busy.
So some people have been naming it
Student hours, yeah. I actually thought review, I call them student hours now. And it's funny because I feel self-conscious doing that. I'm like, I have student hours. And the students are like, that makes sense. But I'm like, they're supposed to be called office hours. But I love just calling them review hours. It's like, that's what we're doing. If you don't know, there's a professor at the University of South Carolina, Vijay Sathy, S-A-T-H-Y. She has this really cool graphic of what office hours are. You can find it, I can send it to you. You can find it online or on Twitter. But she says there's basically 3 things you can do in office hours. You can meet. I can't remember what the 3 are, but there's basically like informal meeting, there's asking questions, and there's doing work. And it's like, you can do any of those. So why, not like, why do you come to my office? But think about this and say, here's the kinds of things you could do if you come to my student hours.
I was going to add something actually one slide back about making an effort to learn their names. And I know for my students of color, my international students, learning how to pronounce their names correctly also has added value for them.
Yes.
So I felt like that was worth mentioning.
No, it's really important. And I know it's hard too because I'm self-conscious about getting it wrong. And what in the past I would do is then not use their name at all because I didn't want to get it wrong. And I have been taught by colleagues that what I should do is keep asking for grace and keep trying hard because the effort matters. And if I get it right, then we all get to celebrate. It's like a miracle, right? Okay, so yeah.
So back in 2013, I had an all-black male. It was designed for an all-black male University 10 course, freshman orientation, and it just so happened that there was this 27-year-old white Mormon student who wanted to be in the class, so I let him come to class, right? So not only did I learn their names, but also I gave them a responsibility in class, like when it was time to show something on the screen, I had somebody turn out the lights, right? So everyone has some type of responsibility in class. And I can say this now because I'm retiring at the end of next month. But also, if they came late to class, they had to do push-ups. But it was a fun class, right? So
it was a community.
Yes, it was.
Yeah. And you had something in common, you bonded. Yeah.
But it was also hazing, so my bad.
But just a silly response to that, but a number of colleagues, and I've started doing this too, in face-to-face classes, I don't have a coming to class late policy. To begin, I ask my students on the first day, how do we treat people who come late? Right? And not like, giving them multiple choice, make them do push-ups,
right.
Shun them, make them sing a song or something. But say, so how do we do this as a group? What's our expectation about people being ready, people being engaged, etc.? And students usually are more strict than I would be. And it's really helpful to say, you all came up with this, which is, you have to stand on your head for 5 minutes now, whatever. But so making it something that's like, we're in this together. How do we do this? You can't do this with a class of 300 probably, but you can do it in a number of different ways.
Dr. Woodrow's story reminded me, I also teach University 10 from time to time, and had an issue with cell phones one time. I said, next time the cell phone rings, I get to answer it.
Yeah.
And so it happened one day, and they're like, listen to this, I said, hello. And like, this lady said, is this Joshua's phone? And I said, it is, and he is in class right now. Here's his mom.
I love it.
Nobody's phone went off for us.
Now, you're reminding me, years ago I saw Cornel West speak at Vanderbilt in this huge auditorium. and someone's phone went off, and everyone was like, and he was fine. He's like, it's okay. He said, who is it? Is calling. And the person doesn't say anything. He's like, okay, if it's God or Mama, you can talk to him. Otherwise, tell him you're busy. And everybody and turned it into a different thing. But again, what's our software? What's our technology policy here? You know, those are things we can do together. One other, your story got me thinking of something, and I wasn't going to tell this one, but I love this really a lot. There's a professor of psychology at the University of Nebraska, Amanda Williams, super creative and thoughtful teacher. She'd won a bunch of awards for teaching 350-person intro to psych courses. So her chair did what chairs do and said, as a reward, you can now teach a 700-person fully online intro to psych courses, right? No, she does the coolest thing ever. It is so cool. So, fully online, 700 students, totally asynchronous. The first thing they study on purpose is about efficacy, self-efficacy and group efficacy, like how do you set goals and how do you work towards them, right? And so as they're approaching the first exam a couple weeks before, she says, you might have noticed in the learning management system, there's a thing called the student lounge. She does a survey, or she does a poll, and she says, what do you, students, want the class average on this exam to be? And everybody votes. She announces, okay, so the class average you want to be a 75, whatever, right? And she says, the student lounge exists so you all have a convenient place to help each other get to 75. And what happens in the first exam is some people start posting homemade study guides or, TED Talks or whatever. Some people start saying, I'm going to be studying in this coffee shop, or I'll open a Zoom room at this time and study. Some people post memes and all this. And it's sort of active, not super active before that first exam, but sort of active, and the students are helping each other. Gives the first exam, she announces to class, what the average was. And there's either a celebration in the student lounge, or usually they miss on the first exam. And there's oh man, we could do better. And so for the next 3 weeks, the student lounge is buzzing as students are supporting each other. Again, they poll, what do we want the class average to be? It's usually a point or two higher. Usually they get it. Then there's a celebration. And so this class of 700, fully online, fully asynchronous, there's a really strong student community. Not all 700 students are engaging with each other. I don't want to be misleading. But there's a lot of peer engagement going on. And she just set up the space and encouraged the process. I'm like, that's so clever. That's so cool. So use things we already have to make them into spaces where students can interact with each other, with ourselves, and maybe they do push-ups too. Okay. Third example, this we heard from a number of students in some version, and it's a really simple technique. In the book we found where they described this, because students were describing this, and we're like, what do you call it? And they're like, Professor Feldman's class. And so a book we found, and I've got the citation for it, calls it note-taking pairs. And the idea is you just pause class every now and then, get students in groups, either in Zoom or in person, and say, look at your notes for today's class together. Look at both the content and the form. Why are they organized that way? What is in there? How do you improve your notes, etc.? And then, you float around and you go, wow, Kathy takes really good notes. Can I take a picture of your notes and display them? And we say, there's lots of ways to take notes. Look how she organizes her notes. Right? So this shows students, first of all, that you should take notes. Shows them there's different ways of taking notes, because many of them don't have sophisticated, especially disciplinary specific note-taking skills or anything. And it also builds a little bit of community, so they know in my group, don't ask Peter for his notes, but ask Kathy for hers, right? And that's really helpful, because if I miss class, I know what to do. Right? So simple, again. Last example, I don't know if you do this here, but I suspect there's some opportunity for this. If there's not, there should be more. And this kind of program, this is from Florida International University. University of Colorado pioneered this work on what they call learning assistants, which are undergraduates who are paid to be embedded in courses, generally large introductory courses. So these are undergraduates who are trained to be tutors, right? But they don't just sit in the tutoring center once a week, Some of them come to your class. And as students are doing active learning things, they're floating around and doing what good peer tutors would do then, not giving the answers, but encouraging, supporting, directing, etc. So one of the students and Florida International has transformed outcomes in Gateway courses with structured active learning, lots of support for faculty, and a gazillion learning assistants. And it's actually good for the learning assistants and for the students in the courses, right? Rosa Espinal, when we interviewed her, was a sophomore learning assistant. And this is how she described what it felt like being a learning assistant.
I do.
Great.
I took out my notebook from when I was in anatomy as a student. I showed her my notebook and talked with her about how I learned, taking notes, reviewing videos, rereading my notes. She seemed to be inspired and said to me, "How about if I try this?" And she got a better grade for the next exam.
Right? So peers sort of showing what they do, that's really attainable for students. Rosa told us too that one of the things they do at FIU is they tend not to hire students who are sort of straight line A's as learning assistants. Not that they won't hire them, but they're looking for students like Rosa who did poorly on the first exam and then did well because she can understand students who are struggling and she can even talk about struggling. She said more than once she would say to someone, "You're upset about your grade? I had worse than you on the first exam," right? You can do this, right? So setting up peers, but notice these examples, none of them are each of us one-on-one with all our students because that's just not sustainable. So one of the things I want to encourage you to do is think about how do you keep doing what works already, but even more with more of your students. As somebody a student we interviewed for the book, but we didn't put it in the book because it was a little too harsh. We figure out how to do it. The student said, "I wish this institution treated all its students like it treats its honor students." So that is a perceptive critique of higher education. It's like, we know how to do this. We just don't do it for everybody. But think about Peter showed some different examples. I should do those. But think about what do you do? How do you do even more in depth? So I'd love for you to spend maybe 5 minutes back in your group talking about this. And I know it's April and I know the term's almost over, so you might be thinking about this summer, next fall, whatever. But what's something you can do that's going to build relationships between you and your students or among your students? Or how could you work with colleagues to make your program, your work, your curriculum more relational? If you're about to retire, think about whatever you want to think about. Okay, 5 minutes.
They brought a panel together talking about around talking about and how to make it more greater feeling. So just like examples of how this is my office hours, but this is what it means. I really want to see the or just talk about a different policy, but letting the student read it from the get-go. This is my time to talk with you and give back this relationship. So even from the start, just thinking about that as we start to build our classes now, how that in itself is starting to help.
I really agree. I'm super happy about this, but my colleague Irene and I just wrote an article about my dialogue assessment agreements, but also showing
But instead of a syllabus, like lays out all these access points for discussion about what's going to happen in class and dialogue. So like first day of class, say like these are the things I'm planning. Everybody give your input. And so we're trying to invite different kinds of input too, like not just writing, like there's places for emojis, there's places for like numbers and just like question marks and stuff. And then during that, I usually respond. I have small enough classes that I can do this. I'll respond individually to each student based on what he says, and then we also say that like kind of that's sort of the thing that you agree on, negotiate at the beginning of the semester, and its terms of assessment, like what the course projects are, all kinds of stuff. Like what happens in the policies, and then you talk about it again mid-semester, and maybe renegotiate, and then have a conversation at the end of the semester and go over So I've done versions of that for the last 5 or 6 years, but this is the first time we're doing that specifically. And this was the first semester I did it.
I feel like that could be, Chip, did you do that one by one? I feel like that's something to be adapted as like a
yeah, and that's actually how I did it. I mean, I talked to them individually, but I just I say like, here's my course description. What would you like to add? And so I've done it in a Google Doc where everybody just kind of puts it up and they talk about it together. So it can be very low labor, actually. And I've asked students also to say, like, here's my course objective, is there an objective that you want, that you have for class? And then I also say, like, that's maybe your objective that you're in charge of for everybody. So it's not like there's like 10 more things that we have to do. It's like, how are you going to be responsible for the learning?
So about 1 more minute in your small group.
Thinking about it, it's not something traditional, but I think all the data pollution on peer-to-peer and increasing our footprint, but it just seems like so much of the coach here, you were able to create kind of communities and groups that could do what you were able to, the relational connection you guys want. So I think that
Yeah, I feel like we conversation. I think a lot of that is to talk to these relationships. I know so many people are as a person, so many different students I want to, I need a little bit more support in the future. So that's a different conversation, but I think that's really very
I feel like I have a ton of ideas. One thing I have like notes on is assessing. Like there's a whole conversation about assessment, relationships, and race equity issues. So that's all fun. And then I also just started this semester thinking about ways that we really want to replace our 1 hour So I'm thinking about ways of organization to create mentorship networks in our organization, but also as campus. Like one of the students now will be there next year. She's like, I do this stuff. And she's like, we need to do something with them. I was like, all right, let's create some support system, especially new students, getting them in touch with building communities across access and budget so that they can find mentors that match them maybe with their personal background or their personal goals, whatever. So So that's one of like the, and I have like so many ideas what I want to do with this. So I'm this is new for them. And I feel like that's going to be an important way for us to create a system in our major, which I think we already do really well, but it's those students who like fall through the cracks that I'm like, how are we going to catch those quiet students? Some students feel like they don't belong before they get or a catalog grants to make sure that they're getting funded as well. And I never let them know. Just technology to embrace social media. That's a little bit broad. So I'm having to do things outside of that idea.
Okay, friends, we need to come back together. I'm sorry. The good news is you can keep talking to each other after the workshop's over, too. Just because we end sort of on time doesn't mean you have to end. And there are a few more donuts left because I haven't eaten them all. So you had good things to talk about. One of the things I want to encourage you to do, especially if you haven't talked to the people in your small group ever or for a while, is like you could keep talking. I'm serious, like you could, get together in a few weeks and have coffee or go for a walk, or in the fall get together and say, what are we going to do? Right? Because having somebody else support you and remind you what you say you want to do is pretty important because we get busy and we get tired. So any questions, concerns, ideas that came out of that small group discussion? Should we talk about your question?
So I asked the question, so I work on relationships with my students, and as happens to all of us, sometimes students disappear, right? So I'll text or email like, hi, are you okay? And sometimes those students never re-engage, you never see them again. But sometimes my concern is they'll say, well, I didn't want you to be disappointed in, sort of speaking to that relationship. And I'm like, well, how do I fix that?
Yeah.
Because I want them to have, to feel that relationship and it can be motivating, but how do you avoid this sort of cycle of shame? Like, oh, she was motivating me and she's been very kind, and now I don't want to disappoint her, so I'm going to disappear because I don't know how to deal with something. And I'm like, how do I fix that?
And my answer was, good luck. No, I mean, and not to say anything profound, but students come in various states of life, right? And so this is a challenge, and too many students, are used to being in relationships where people express disappointment in them, things like this, right? And so there's not a simple way to do this. I do think, as we were talking, and you were saying, expressing my care for you as a person, my belief in your capacity to be successful, even if you're not going to be successful this semester. I had a student once who missed 8 weeks and came back a week before the end. He's like, what can I do? And I'm like, dude, that ship has sailed. We could talk about next semester. He's like, what can I do? And I'm like, you could have showed up anytime or responded to my emails, right? But if they trust me, they're more likely to reach out. And then doing what you can in that, again, to affirm that I believe in your capacity, regardless of the outcome for this course. And that's about what we can do, I think. I want to close, just to be respectful of time. We can hang out for a while and talk more. But I want to close just with 3 thoughts from students. Because students taught me a lot in this. Well, actually, this one is about students. It's not from students. It's from Donna Lindemann, who runs this. She's now got a really fancy title. She's like vice chancellor for the university, or for CUNY, which is the biggest university system in the U.S., City University of New York. And she runs this program that's amazing called ASAP, which is for low-income, first-gen community college students. ASAP students graduate at 3 times the rate of their peers, right? And it's really wraparound support and a ton of faculty development. It's pretty magic. But this is what Donna says ASAP is all about. Somebody have this one? Great, thank you.
Many of our students haven't necessarily tapped into the gifts and the skills they already have, their own tenacity, their own intelligence. We help them understand that they are fully capable, every single one of them, of earning their degrees. We ask, what are the things that you work towards and achieve? That is essential to them being able to say and believe, I am good at things, I can commit to things, and I can finish them.
Thank you. All right, so our psychology colleagues can get you into some of the research about this kind of intervention, which can be really powerful. Saying, describe something you're good at. And what do you do when you encounter a challenge in that thing you're good at? Could you behave that same way in my class? How could you? What would you do? Right? So really helping students see the power that they have within them, even if they've never been good at school. So second, this is from Taylor Schlesinger, a student at LaGuardia Community College, and I put this one in here because of where we are in the term, perhaps, at least where I am in the term. Taylor, when we interviewed her, it was her second time at college. She was a writing center consultant when we interviewed her. But she talked about this professor when she came back to college for the second time. Her first semester, she had this required writing course. And the professor, about halfway through the course, at the beginning of class one day, just said something to the whole class.
Near the end of the semester, one of my best students is going to stop coming to class because they feel overwhelmed with all the pressure and they are really scared that they are going to do poorly. I want to assure that student to keep coming to class, even if you missed an assignment or feel like you didn't do well on an essay, because it's going to be okay. Come see me. Don't just disappear.
Right. So Taylor said she was sure he was talking to her, so she actually did that. And went to his office, and it did turn out okay, and she ended up being a writing center consultant. But why she told this story wasn't about herself. She said every semester in the writing center, I get a handful of students who come in and say, Professor whatever said, I bet you're thinking about dropping out. And she's like, he didn't say it to you, did he? Like, no, he said it to the whole class. And so sometimes we can say things, everything doesn't have to be one-on-one to be powerful. It can be. I'm not trying to diss one-on-one. One-on-one just isn't very sustainable. So thinking about ways we can convey this to all our students and let them sort of lean in. And the last quote I get, because, oh no, there's one more. I got Samantha right here. Samantha Paskvan, when we interviewed her, just really quickly, favorite double major ever, genetics and dance at the University of Washington. And she talked about struggling for a couple of years in STEM courses. She really wants to be a doctor. And not struggling getting grades, but like not finding her people. With dance, she had her people. In chemistry, which she thought she was going to major in, she didn't have her people. She took a genetics course. She loved the course. It was lots of active learning, lots of group work. She went up to the professor at the end of the quarter and said, could I work in your research lab? And he said, no. I don't have any room, but let me introduce you to some other genetics faculty. And she ended up in somebody else's research lab. This is how she described that experience.
Beyond the serious science we're doing, there's this whole other aspect of caring about each other's lives. The faculty will make the time to ask, how are your classes going? What are you thinking about for next year? What are you getting involved in outside of the lab? Who do you want to be after you graduate? And then they would really listen and encourage me, even when I wasn't sure if I knew what I was doing or where I was going.
Thanks. So notice this, because I went into this research for this book like, I am not a trained counselor. I don't know how to do this. Those questions I know how to ask. And what Samantha found empowering wasn't the professors giving her answers. It was listening and encouraging. Right? It's like, I think I can do that. Right? In fact, silly story, but when Leo and I were doing this after 4 campus visits, we kept asking students, what's the most powerful question anybody asks you on campus that's built relationships? And all of the students in the first 4 campuses said, how are you? And we're like, we're going to write a book and publish it with Johns Hopkins, and we're going to say, ask your students, how are you? Thank you. But maybe it's not that complicated. So last quote from Chiana Guerra, student at Oakton Community College, it only takes me to that one person who ignites a fire within you. That's what the research says. And what I want to leave you with is just thinking your class, your interactions with students, that can be a place where the student's going to meet that person. And the other thing, and this sounds weird, but that person's probably not going to be you. And actually, that's okay. Because you can't do that for all your students. That person is probably going to be a peer. So how do you make your interactions with students a place where they're going to find that person? Right? Sometimes you get invited to weddings, but mostly you don't, and it's good because you couldn't buy them any wedding gifts. themselves. Right, but they can do that for each other. This all builds on lots of other people's stuff. Thanks for having me. I'm happy to hang around and talk. And thanks for engaging so well.
Before you tuck it in, if you've been to an MT Engage meeting, you know we're known for our food and our prizes, right? So we've got our giveaways here. My random number generator and I went through here. So number 23 was Amy Say Word. What? You want to trade for the book? Number 14, Jason Pettigrew. Why don't I just let you pick what you want? Number 3, Jen Caputo. If you'd rather have the book, I got another one. Sure. I would like to have the book. Okay. Sandra Poirier. I'm out of books. And Michelle Stevens. What do I do with it? What is it? I don't know. It's a microphone if you're doing online or Zoom. Okay. All right. Julie's going to make a quick announcement about our Summer Institute, and then we'll dismiss.
Yes, we will be having an in-person Summer Institute May 10th and 11th this year. It does tend to fill up pretty quickly. If you are interested, you are welcome to email me and let me know that. And if you don't get in this year, I can put you on the waiting list for next year. And another thing I would like to mention is if you are already an MT Engage faculty member and you are teaching new courses that you have started teaching since you attended Summer Institute, since you certified previous courses, and you want those to be MT Engage, let me know. We have a certification form you can fill out for those. So you can add those anytime, right? It doesn't just have to be the ones you initially certified as part of your participation in the Summer Institute. We're happy to add them anytime. Also, I am happy to come and meet with you and your colleagues. If you can't come to Summer Institute, but you want to get several more people in your department on board, you can email me and I would be happy to have smaller group meetings with you all. Or if you just have ideas for things you would like to do in your teaching, in your classes, I'm happy to have a conversation anytime. So thank you all so much for being here. Really appreciate you and all you do for students, and have a great rest of the day.